Thank you, Ali. I'll give a plug for the book too. Every penny that you pay for that goes back to the Axe. The Beaverbrook just donated them to the Axe, so just as a fundraiser, so as well.
That's great.
That's all right.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for having us. It's always great to drive down to Sussex on a day like today and to hang out with Peter and Beth, two of my favorite people. Absolutely.
Did you come down along the river?
I did. Always do. Always do. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are going to totally ad-lib this, and there'll be a chance to ask questions. From my perspective, this has been such a gift to have John curate this show and go through the long process of finding work and how persistent you were making me dig through the attic. And he found things I didn't know I had, some of which are here. And, you know, you frequently see retrospectives that are for a short period of time, but this being 50, really almost 52, 53 years now because of the COVID delays. And it was a huge chance for me to kind of get a sense of my own career when I first walked through the doors at the Beaverbrook, and I had nothing to do with setting it up. I knew it was going to be chronological. And I think it was about 160 feet of this table. I did a rough count, and there were close to that many pieces. It was kind of mind-blowing, really, for me to see how many different things I'd tackled, but getting to see how they related a bit to each other. And it made me feel kind of exhausted, too, because it just was so much work. But the chronological thing, and not having the precious object approach, but just piece after piece after piece, which this does as well, but they're bigger jumps. Mm-hmm. And so, John, I mean, when you kind of came up with your original vision, it was really different than anything I'd seen before or was used to. It took me a bit to get used to the idea of having that many pieces in chronological order, although chronology was really the only way we could get our hands.
It would have been a mess to do it otherwise. I think that was some of it, is sometimes it looked complicated. So picture this sort of ribbon, and I use that word sort of literally and figuratively as well, the idea of almost like this sort of river of 50 years. I mean, take half a century. I mean, that's, I don't see well, but I mean, I'm 52. I mean, that's in my entire age of your career. That how do you express the workings of a half century of an artist who's still so vibrant and contemporary and vigorous and still working? And so it was the idea of nothing sort of frozen in time, but of something living. And so I thought, just in discussions with you and with Beth as well, you know, coming to the farm and really enjoying those experiences, the idea of something as organic as possible, because I think even your working is very organic. I mean, you're also very connected, obviously, to the land and the landscape, the seasons, and not even, I think, in a cliched way. It's part of it. And something that didn't feel sort of forced and taxidermized, right, which I think would have been really wrong. And there was a lot of work, so I think it really felt alive and not chaotic in a way, but sometimes a bit of a jumble, but it made sense. It was like your life, you know. I mean, trying to fit it in.
It interested me seeing how things wove in and out. Something would appear in the 80s and kind of fade away, but then there'd be stuff like from those Bracu vases to these, which were probably done 20 years later or something like that. They relate. They've changed, but it's still the same kind of approach.
Yeah, we come back. But even color, I mean, I'm looking even next to you behind. We haven't talked about some of these specifically, but the blue stick plate, which is only a few years old, that color blue rarely sort of found itself in your work of the 2000s and 90s, but very much in the early 90s and 80s. And so things kind of keep coming back in cycles, yeah. It was interesting too, because we also had, not that we're doing things on the cheap, but we're still New Brunswick. We don't have the budget to say an art gallery of Ontario would have. And so we had to figure out how could this exhibition, which also traveled to Brampton, the outskirts of Toronto, and to St. John as well. So we had to set up this in multiple configurations of rooms. So I had to have a system that would be able to be, again, organic and flowing. So thought of this series of small Baltic plywood tables. This is really high quality plywood, but these are $5 IKEA legs that are also leveling at the bottom. So we had to order 220 of them. You know, $1,200 worth of IKEA legs. Yeah. And the guy delivering them, who the hell orders this many legs? I said, well, Peter Powning does, right, for his exhibition.
They've been out of them ever since.
Yeah, and so they could also work, and even coming here for the setup, you know, the guys, you kind of move some things around. Well, a curve is better here. You can sort of push and pull, and I think even as a metaphor for your own way of working was very much that. You kind of have a plan and it sort of changes a bit and you shift and whatever works, right? I mean, it felt, everything kind of felt right. It felt very Powning-like in a way. You know, whatever, and I don't actually say that with any hyperbole. I think I kind of mean that. But it worked really well. And nothing broke.
No, I know.
That was the other thing. Everything's open.
People
it's like, whoa.
were worried about the tables being unstable or narrow. You know, obviously if somebody had tripped and barged into them, it
it'd be a disaster. Yeah.
But so would plinths. I mean, you know, it just, I loved it. I think your architectural background served you in good stead for
it helped.
Your mind works the way you could make that work out and have those configurations adapt to all these different spaces. So, and then the book was. Is there
a copy of the book? Someone? Yeah. Is there one right there, Ali? Or? Yeah. The book was great. Did you say now? I think I've asked this, but when I dropped it off to you, I think I gave you one copy at first and a bunch because we had just a couple, and you said you slept with it under your pillow the first night.
I hug it every day.
Oh, one's good, I think. Yeah, but did he sleep with it under his pillow? Oh, you said he did.
Might have been hyperbolic, but
I don't know. But we worked with Goose Lane on it, and we're so lucky here in New Brunswick to have, I think, probably the finest art book publisher in the country. Goose Lane are in Fredericton, about 6 blocks from the Beaverbrook, and the work is wonderful, and they're professional. And
Julie Scriver and the people that Beth wrote an essay. You were the editor. Peter Leroux from the New Brunswick Museum writes an essay about early career mostly.
Yeah. Just pass this around if you just like to see it. If that's right.
You tell the story about.
About Alan?
Alan Bentley.
Oh, geez. This was poignant, quite wonderful. Alan Bentley, if you know, he was a professor at STU. Richard, you went to STU, didn't you? Did you have Alan?
I did.
Was he a good prof?
The best.
There you go.
And the best man. Just a great person.
A great man, absolutely. Alan became a very good friend of mine, and he knew you. I'm not sure. Did he ever meet you, Beth, back in the day? But he'd written about you for Arts Atlantic, kind of in the '80s. He was an English prof at STU, very respected, and he was a global expert in myth and symbolism of sort of Greek mythology and medieval studies, that kind of thing. Of one of the biggest experts in the world on William Blake, for example. So, and very down-to-earth guy, friendly, approachable. But when he would get down into the minutiae of Greek myth, you would sit back and go, how can a human have this amount of perception? It was quite remarkable. And he would always bring that into his art analysis. And so he very much liked your work. And he was retired. He was kind of getting on. He said, I'm not going to write anymore. But he always said to me, he said, Johnny, he called me Johnny. He said, Johnny, if there's something you want me to work on with you, I'd love to do like one more thing. And so I asked him, would you like to write an essay for the Peter Powning catalog? And he said, absolutely, because he liked your work, knew you, very much admired your work. And so every person's essay of the 5 authors in this picked a certain element. And Alan's was the myth and symbolism connections to greater human myths within the work of, Prometheus and fire and all these kinds of things. And it was remarkable. And he did this great essay. And I was going down to visit Peter and Beth one day in November, a couple years ago. I said, Alan, would you and your wife, Jeannie, like to come down? Because he hadn't seen you in decades. I said, sure, I'd love to come down. Came down, spent a few hours at the farm, had tea, spoke, saw the work. And then there with you, we said, you know what? I want to rewrite my essay. He was so inspired by that visit and the discussion. We said, okay, but we've got publishing deadlines. You've got a month and we have to have it. He said.
Another part of this was he brought what he wrote.
Oh, that's right. And he let you read it.
And he gave it to me to read, which was right now in front of you. I said, I'm going to have to go in the other room.
And it blew you away because all of a sudden you're being compared to, Zeus and.
Yeah, it was mind-numbing, really. I mean, I was totally, thrown by it, really. I mean, it was just such a unexpected point of view. But he wasn't comparing me to Zeus. Our neighbor's dog is named Zeus.
Oh, Zeus. No, within the realms of these,
the symbolism and the ancient themes and things that I was obviously unintentionally working with. So it was just such a great experience.
Yeah, it was.
And that essay is in the book.
Yeah, well, and that was version 1 of the essay, and we said, can you rewrite it? He wanted to add a few more, and he said, well, of course. So he said, you have a month. And so we went home, and it was a wonderful day. We went home, and I think it was 3 days later, he passed in the revise. He just got right to it. He couldn't wait. 3 days later. Anyway, he died the next day. So, I mean, awful. I mean, he was in his 80s, but led a great life. And so one of those amazing things was just that, however you want to think about it, the last thing he did was write your essay, and he had to get it out. And it was this powerful thing. And he died, no, it wasn't a painful death. He just sort of went to sleep, and that was it. But I mean, that the last thing this great man and great thinker did was the Peter Powning essay. And it was just lovely. And so the book is dedicated to Alan as well, and as one of the essays. So
the book is worth it just for his essay, in my opinion.
Yeah. And one thing I will say about these pictures, one of the things that made this project immeasurably more fun, more rewarding, and a heck of a lot easier was Peter is a fantastic photographer, and he took the photographs of all of these objects and chronologically through his career. So had you not done that and been so astute and rigorous in doing that, this book almost couldn't have been done, because some of the objects are gone, or to rephotograph and find them, and they're fantastic studio photographs. So everything in the book, with maybe a 1% exception, are Peter's photographs.
So, very briefly, we moved here in 1970, spent summers here for well, actually, two summers, and then in 1972 we immigrated and set up the studio and started right in making work. And maybe this is the time to hand around the mug. This was
1970s mug, yeah.
1970s stoneware, functional work that we made. And one of the really cool things that I didn't realize was cool at the time was that the Dyckman Pottery had been here, and the latter part of their career had been living in what is now the Wallace Funeral Home. And so they were real pioneers in the early craft movement in North America, really, but certainly in Canada. And so when I began showing up with my pots, everybody's saying, oh, well, you must know the Dyckmans, or blah, 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 the Dyckmans. So the younger me was a bit irritated, to be honest with you, because all anybody wanted to do was talk about the Dyckmans. Oh, they had such a nice blue. Well, that's a blue, but theirs was really nice. So, but at any rate, and we got to meet Erica Dyckman. By that time, Kelvin had passed away. And she came out to the studio, and she was very generous, but we didn't see a whole bunch of her. She lived in Fredericton by then. But the way had been paved for the idea that what I was doing was kind of interesting and a legitimate thing to be doing. So within, I think in 1974, we opened the Jabberwock with Lee and Mary Danish. And that was where we made a significant part of our living for about 9 years. And people here were incredibly supportive and interested. And it was a time when, you know, if I'd decided to do this somewhere else, or if it had been a few years earlier, it would have been a much harder row to hoe.
So how many people here bought stuff at Jabberwock? Jeez. There you go.
Okay. So, yeah, it's in the empty lot now on Broad Street. And, you know, that was kind of a, I wouldn't say down and out, but it was a bit derelict down in that part of, that end of Broad Street. And once we opened the gallery, other things began to happen, not necessarily because of us, just because of the times and vacant spaces and cheap rents. Our rent for the original space was $80 a month, which we split, so it was $40 each. Now, you know, that's with inflation and stuff, that'd probably be a little bit more now, but it gave us, helped give us a start. So that was kind of the atmosphere, and there were the what was then called the Brunswick Craftsmen's Council. That the man got knocked off of that fairly quickly, but was transitioning from being a kind of the older generation, people who are now, who were my age then, you know, all the old farts. And this younger generation came in and was kind of pushing for higher, different jurying standards, and brought new life to the organization. And the Fundy Craft Festival was down at Fundy Park, which was one of two in the province at that time. Mactaquac was the other one. And we could go to those two shows and make half our living just going to two shows. Now, a living at that point was pretty close to the bone, but you know, it was good. We were young. And then, and gradually, by the time, let's see, it was 1976, I was feeling kind of burned out, which seems very strange to me now, but it was heavy production. So we are, I made pots like crazy for about a year, and we filled the cellar of the Jabberwock with them, and we went away for a year. We went on a Russian liner from New York City to Europe, and we spent the summer hiking and traveling. And then we spent the winter in London, where I went to the Croydon College of Art and Design and just had free, I wasn't taking courses, I was just allowed to do anything I wanted. And we were going to the British Museum, all kinds of things going on. So we had this huge cultural hit and got to see a lot of British masters and people that were a big influence. And I began doing photo silk screening. There's some of that there. I developed a way to put photo silk screened images on pots. So anyway, I came back from that full of the reality that there was a much bigger world out there than making brown pots, which I continued to make because that's what we made our living on. But from then on, I was always experimenting and trying other things, and that was really key to my career, but it was also key to kind of my staying sane and being interested in things. So kind of circling back to this, by the early 80s, I was making work like this that I really didn't know what to do with. And somebody saw, we were at a craft show in St. Andrews. It was a total blowout. Nobody showed up, nothing sold. somebody looked at my work and said, you really need to be at the one-of-a-kind show in Toronto. So that was another big shift going there, because then I bumped into Prime Gallery, galleries in Montreal. So suddenly my practice had shifted from craft fairs and the Jabberwock to a gallery practice. And this work was, oh yeah, I've got the button. I keep waiting. Why don't they change the slide?
Yeah, you're in command of your life, Peter.
Yeah.
You got it.
So this was typical of that. And, you know, I made a catalog that we sent around. Tried all different kinds of things. Online marketing. No, it wasn't online. We have mail order catalog. That was a total bomb. And you know, part of the experimentation, I was messing around with flammable fluids instead of just sawdust, and I began to get these astounding colors. And that was just a result of experimenting, trying something really unlikely, and every now and then, well, actually, that was pretty reliably amazing colors, which unfortunately over time fade. Didn't know it to begin with.
Can I say, Peter, the first time I ever saw you work in the mid-'90s, it was this era of work, and was just bowled over by it. And you know, again, astounding work. And the first thing I ever bought for my mom, I say that was actually a kind of a quality gift. It was in my mid-20s. I could buy her something nice. I bought her a Peter Powning vase, of a raku multicolored vase. Had no idea who he was, but I liked his name, Powning. It sounded, you know, tough and virile, and these beautiful colors. And it was actually in the exhibition, because it was a sort of flute verted, this sort of flared at the top, which was unlike a lot of other things I'd seen. And so Mom still treasures it.
And it did. That was one of the pieces that held its color, probably because it wasn't on a windowsill or in bright light. Yeah. Because that was the issue. I had some of this in the cellar that the New Brunswick Museum bought. It was still just as bright, but it didn't have a lot of light exposure.
Ooh, this was the one we were scared of. The tippy was going to break.
Yeah, that is fairly biggish, and just kind of racing through things that happened. I began messing around with metals and eventually glass, and I had a solo show at the Canadian Clay Glass Gallery in Waterloo, and I made a lot of work for that. This was one of the specimens, and that toured, and the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia bought it for their collection, and John borrowed it, and that is an example of cast bronze, glass, and clay. So I did a lot of work like that, and there's some examples of that in the show. Oh.
How cool is that? I mean, that's, you know, yeah.
This was early 80s too. I think it was 1983, and the pyramid piece in the back was one of my first public art commissions. And a friend, Derek Fletcher, who was the project manager for Market Square Development, sent me this picture that had showed up in the London
Times or London.
A glossy magazine, kind of like Life magazine, and I was knocked out because we had gone to the dinner with the royals with
Charles.
Yeah, right, Charles and Di, and got to watch Richard Hatfield create one of the two most notable disasters in the royal year, apparently, according to the royal press. Anyway, so that was pretty exciting. But
well, just a second, what did Hatfield do? What's the 10-second version of what he did? Was it a just terrible speech? Or
he was so smitten with Di. He spent the whole time they were supposed to be eating, yakking at her, and it was, I assume, a bulimic stage or something. She didn't eat anything. And then he got up and spoke and said, he started out with, "We have heard the lies," and this somnambulant press corps that was on a platform at the back of the room. Suddenly everybody woke up, and the cameras, went up. And he said, "But now we have met the truth, and the truth is love." And he carried on like that for quite a while. And it was, I don't know, it was kind of shocking and funny at the same time.
And then King Charles stood up and said, "Oh, I didn't realize your premier was such a poet." And and you could see that he was just like, "Oh, God, so bad."
Yeah. At any rate, he was speaking from the heart, which you have to admire, but you don't usually do that in front of the international press if you can help it. So I just started making these things. I wanted to do public commissions. I had done that one at Market Square. I had this notion that if I put together a big brochure and sent it to all the architects in New Brunswick, that the floodgates would be open and I'd be doing public commissions. That didn't happen. I didn't realize so much later that architects weren't the people to go to. It was developers, and even then, really, not until there were percentage for the art program where there was a designated percentage of the building costs that had to be spent on public commissions or something related to the arts, that there began to be that kind of commission work. But once I was showing with Sandra Ainsley in Toronto, which was a huge gallery, I just began making stuff. These are like 7, 8 feet tall pieces that people call garden sculptures. So I was selling a fair number of those, although I still own quite a few, thinking that if I had these on my resume, that would help me to get commissions for bigger work. And so in 2006, I got the commission just based on those smaller pieces, and the one in Market Square. Those were 14 feet tall, plus the height of the planters they were in, and they had a digital light array inside them. They were supposed to be about the theme was supposed to be the Northern Lights. That was what I was given. So at night, those slowly changed colors. And so at that point, I was working with Sussex Machine Shop and producing these big things. The walls of those, they're like stud walls, are filled with broken French crystal lamps that I got in Utah, where they sold crushed glass that they tumbled in big cement mixers that people used instead of lawns in the desert. Very strange. A blue lawn with broken glass. I saw a couple places like that. It wasn't. Anyway, it was what it was. But so, got to do some great mountain biking in Utah when we went out to do that. And so that was a big breakthrough, because suddenly I had this big piece that was on Bay Street in Toronto. And I went to a friend who was a developer in Toronto before I did my presentation to these guys, and I asked him if I could just show him the work, because I was really nervous about it. And so he called his team in, and they watched it. And right after I got that commission, they began wanting me to do work for them. So that was a big break. So this is a piece in the lobby of the Festival Tower, which is the TIFF building, the Toronto International Film Festival, that the developer built. So I had a couple of commissions for that, and this one's 9 by 12 with glass and bronze with a huge screen behind it of video that I shot to kind of evoke the cinema. And this one's down, this is Memory Vessel. It's down by the harbor, the Reversing Falls Bridge in St. John. Like this, using the same kind of materials as the other one that's about 14 feet long. So from about, actually by the 2000s, I was doing a lot of the range of work you see more on this side, and beginning to get fairly regular public commissions from 2006 till now. And this is in Canmore, Alberta. Fantastic place to work and an amazing community. So that was when I began getting public involvement, doing impressions of people's objects in the bronze, to get the public, having the public get involved in the project from the beginning, rather than some object dropping in from outer space that the community really knew nothing about and had no connection with. And one of the reasons I got this commission is because they had 2 or 3 years before that, they'd gone through a public commissioning process that people in town weren't involved in at all. And it caused a big controversy. People hated it. It was across the river from some people who they thought had wrecked their view. And it began to come apart within a couple of years because it wasn't engineered or well made. So they wanted to be sure that they had something that the community was involved in and wasn't going to fall apart. So I guess I convinced, it's still standing, I can tell you that. And then this is on Harbor Passage in St. John. And again, this is a community involvement thing where people brought in objects, historical objects. And so there's a chronology of those bands going around the object. And this is another example of kind of diving in the deep end, thinking I could do something, and then just having to figure out how to do it. I'm not sure I made any money on this in the end, and it got delayed, but I frequently find myself in these projects with having to, this was done with sprayed concrete, having to figure out how to make it work. Thinking I knew to begin with, and then finding out that the engineer had mentioned that it needed a form to do the concrete in. Anyway, I won't go into too much. If anybody wants to ask me about this parts of this were a nightmare. And then this is an example of a private commission for it's 7 feet tall. It's marble from Nelson Monuments and cast bronze.
That one, by the way, if you go back just for a second, Peter, if I actually had to pick one project, that was in the book, wasn't in the show. If I had to pick one piece, I think that's my favorite piece of all the ones in the book. I love that.
You wouldn't have liked it so much after trying to move it around, though.
Oh no, I'd get someone else to move it.
So this is in Moncton. It's called Resurgo. That went through the whole process of being shortlisted, having to propose it to the jury selecting it, then having to talk to town council about it in Moncton. And this was another huge project that I did. That's 27 feet tall. And the way I started out was I just made a model out of rigid foam and covered it with aluminum foil to show the jury, and then had a draftsman draft it up so that for working drawings for the machine shop and the engineer, everything has to be engineered. And most of it got made in the, well actually I did all the work at the Sussex machine shop, where they do all the structural stuff, I do the finishes, I do a bit of welding depending on what it is, no structural stuff. And it's been fantastic working with a local shop like that. The first time I showed up, they thought I was from Mars. And I don't know how many of you have experiences working in these kind of industrial kind of atmosphere where people are pretty, they don't want to look weird in any way. And then along I come, and they've all got kinds of nicknames for the things they're making. But I've been working there for probably, well, 20 years. And now I just fit right in. They seem to enjoy the weirdness. It's a break from welding tractors and mining equipment. And this is my most recent commission that's finished, and that's in
Hanwell.
Hanwell. Thank you. My mind went blank. It's a veterans memorial. Again, using the bronze to take impressions of things. So we did it. Beth and I did a day at the fire department in Hanwell, and people brought in medals and memorabilia in relation to veterans in their family or veterans themselves. We had a big kind of motorcycle gang of guys that had been in all different places, but primarily I'd say Afghanistan. And it was really interesting, emotional experience seeing them. You could see that quite a few of them probably were suffering from PTSD, or, you know, that it had shaped their lives.
Yeah, like I say, one of the things that's really interesting about this piece in the exhibition, so they're not here, but in the stop in Fredericton, we had about a dozen of his maquettes or small architectural models. So, you know, whenever you do these, you don't just start building it. You say the scale model is probably about like 1 to 12 or something, 1 to 20. And this one was in it. So this was unveiled Remembrance Day 2022. So, you know, 6-7 months ago. So during the run of the exhibition, kind of at the start, this was in the show. So it's amazing. In retrospective, you talk about that work of a living artist. It went from work that he did in 1971, and so as a student, to something that was unveiled like that week. So talk about fresh. It was really great to have that piece in there. So people said, "Oh, that was just done. He did that." Yeah. So yeah, I mean, just the idea of a living, you know, of a career that's still very much alive. This really helped a lot with a lot of people that saw it.
I think one of the other things is I've done quite a few pieces in New Brunswick, and seeing these little maquettes, which is where I start. I sketch, but I don't draw in the sense that I'm really good at rendering things. But my sketching is working with the materials. So the maquettes themselves are my starting point and my finishing point in terms of the creative portion. Because when you're doing these public commissions, once you've done the maquette and using Photoshop to drop it into the site and make it look real, after that I become the project manager, because I can't decide halfway through it, I don't like this, I think I'll do it another way. I mean, there might be that kind of problem solving, but it's got to look pretty much like, or exactly like whatever the maquette was. So that is the really creative stage, is coming up with something that I can make the model of, that I have to get okayed by an engineer so that it can be built and won't fall over. And then the project managing, one of the things that surprised me about myself is I enjoy project managing these big projects and working with subcontractors, and I was okay doing it. So I think this, that's the last of the slides. I just wanted to cover that part of my life and practice, because it's been a big part of it that people don't generally see in the neighborhood.
Peter, you go back to that last one and even the research one. Can you explain that to me? You describe me what that is and what the texture, how thick it is, how the designs are, what the designs are about. Okay,
so this one's the simplest one to explain. It's based on an obelisk, which is a traditional Egyptian form, I think, with the Greeks, and the Greeks took it over too. Actually, it's wound its way through history. So
the Washington Monument is an obelisk and funeral.
So my idea, and I've used the pyramid and obelisk form a fair amount. One of the reasons is to get height. The other reason is that it's a recognizable form, so people connect with it in historical terms, whether they know it or not. But then I try to do something with it that makes it contemporary and has its own individual presence. And with this one, Hanwell's is got this a natural theme going with a nature park, and they're trying to connect with their surroundings in that way. And so the obelisk itself is laced like branches against the sky, so that this rigid kind of formal form becomes more natural, and light does interesting things with it. There's light inside it, so at night it's lit from inside. So that's the basic form. And from a practical point of view, it's a fairly simple one to make when there isn't a huge budget. And then the bronze wrap is the sort of embrace, in this particular case, of the community. And that ribbon of bronze has all the impressions in relief of the objects that people brought in. So in all of those pieces that had the bronze relief, you have metals. There was an impression of a pipe. There were kilt pins. There were a lot of metals. But there was a whole bunch of other things that connected them with some of the things were with parents or grandparents who had served in the military one way or the other. So that is, and one of the typical things that happens with these, they're at a height where you can view them and touch them. When the openings I've done, I guess, 5 or 6 that had this technique in engaging the public, that people are walking right up to them and rubbing them and pointing out whose is what's, and it really has worked as a community bonding thing, and that people go back to it. They had at this, I think they had something like 400 people show up for the. And it wasn't just because this was here; it was a big celebration. But there were people handling the whole time, which was my hope and goal.
That's one of the things that's really just tangibly remarkable about this, but it's also just, it's your normalcy as well. It's the everyday, is just the wealth and the richness of different materials that you use. I mean, everything, clay, glass, metal, paper, photography, not a lot of wood in here, but I'm sure you use some. There's a little bit of wood, bone, bronze, ceramic. Is there one that you feel that you've kind of yet to master? I mean, I know you're sort of humble to a point, but I mean, say ceramic, you mastered that years ago. Is there one that you still feel that you have a way to go?
Honestly, the idea of mastery is that's I don't think you ever arrive, really. And I guess in some sense I've mastered clay, but I don't like thinking that way, because that makes it feel sort of dead, like I'm dominating it. Because one of the things about making work is it's always an exploration, and throwing a pot, as many as I've made, I don't have like a profile and it's got to fit exactly to this idea I had beforehand. It's a discovery. It's a process working with the materials influencing me, and sometimes doing what it wants instead of what I want. And I think part of being an artist in general, but certainly for me, is you make a lot of mistakes, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but you learn something from it. And a lot of the big jumps I've made in my career have been from things that happened that were kind of unexpected, like the brilliant colors I got on that raku, just because I kept messing around with different ways to reduce the glaze. So I really don't think in terms of mastery. I like the surprise of when things really work better than anticipated.
Well, you know, one of the things that I find fascinating about this is the kind of the miraculous sense of materials and the playfulness and the texture, especially not just color but texture, especially when you look at this one sort of like the, you know, I'd say the kind of football shoulder pad form of the Self series, which are some of my favorite. Those during the exhibition, people were really drawn to the molten glass works, but I went from being amazed to not disappointed, but just when you told me how you made the nimbus, the discus up there, because I thought it would be something so complex, and you said, no, that's just rolled up wet newspaper that when you fire it, it burns away. In the, you know, the voids in that, and I thought that's brilliant, but I almost wanted to say that, oh no, you took this to the, you know, the River Jordan, and you had to do this and this to it, and you know, but you know, sometimes some of your processes are so damn simple, but innovative and smart. You know, that you are effectively a materials engineer in many ways, you know, self-taught, but it's come, right? That if you, I don't know if you can see this one, the voids that are in there looks sort of organic, and it's at the other end of the sort of rusty colored medallion just below the gold. There's all these organic voids, and it's when you made it, you just had newspaper in there, wet, kind of clumpy newspaper. Well, when you fire it, it just burns away, and you get that beautiful void.
But I mean, coming back to, you know, John's comment about my brilliance, it really is really not brilliant so much as just trying stuff. Think what would happen if I did this? And so I'd been working with pulped paper. Beth and I have spent 3 or 4 2-month, 1-month periods at the Banff Center in Canmore, where we could just work. Beth was often working on a book. I always went out with some idea of what I was supposed to do. Sometimes I was a visiting artist, so I had a sort of a job. But I would almost inevitably end up doing something different than I thought I would. And I got involved in making paper for a while, just because it looked interesting and weird that you have this pulp. And I was casting paper for a while, making objects out of this cast paper. And then later, when I was back home in my studio, and I was slip casting. And slip casting is you make a plaster mold, you pour a liquid, what's called deflocculated clay in the mold, you let it sit, and the plaster absorbs the water out of the clay that is against it. And after it's formed some of the skin, you just pour the excess clay out, and then you've got this hollow clay object. And that is a slip cast object. Then I thought, I had the paper pulp, so I thought, well, I wonder what would happen if I threw some paper pulp in here, and before I poured the clay in, and it would resist the clay, and the clay went around it, and I really didn't know what to expect. So when I got the object out, all the voids were packed with paper, and I picked some of it out and then fired it, and it all burned out, and I was left with these amazing organic voids. So it looks like it's kind of rotted, which, you know, that was just messing around, trying to see what would happen. And when I started the bronze foundry, I got interested in working with metal. I took stuff to bronze foundries. It was incredibly expensive, so I started making my own molds and taking the molds to the bronze foundry. It was still expensive, and in New Brunswick there wasn't anybody who poured bronze, so I'd hired a guy named Zach Shuchuk, which some of you might have run into in Sussex in the early 90s. And we made all the equipment together. He was good at that. And started the small foundry, which does, I started out melting and pouring glass and bronze. But once I had that capacity, then I could do all these interesting things that I couldn't do with clay. Or if I'd done them with clay, like branches and things, they'd be so fragile you could barely look at them without them falling apart. And, you know, experimenting with cast bronze, I don't experiment so much with it, because it's a 28 oh, it's 20, it's about 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. All my equipment for that temperature is in Fahrenheit, so I'm not sure what that is in centigrade. 1,200, 1,300? I don't know. It's bloody hot, so you can barely look at it, it's so hot. So I tried pouring bronze around a piece of wood to see what would happen, and it was a little more exciting than I'd bargained for. And you don't really want to have molten bronze shooting around your head and whatnot. So anyway, I think you live and learn from it, and you work with it. I've reached a level of skill where I could make these combinations and have them work.
So say rather than master, you feel you're comfortable with these materials at least now to the point of
I can see their potential, and you kind of you work with that, and you get a level of experience. I like experience rather than mastery. With them, and you see potential, and you just work with it.
Sure. Can I ask you one other thing, Peter, and maybe after just some questions and have a walkabout as well, but I know that one of the things that's critical to, it's your kind of 50-year retrospective, but it's also 50 years of you here in this community. I mean, you're in the same exact spot when you moved here. You're here in Markhamville, but Greater Sussex. And you've given to this place is given to you, and you're really of this place. You helped found Axe. I mean, you're so much, you're a citizen of the world, but very much New Brunswicker, but Sussexonian, or, to that. How has this community really fed your spirit and your energy and your process of who you are as an artist? I mean, what do you think you owe to this community?
Well, a lot. I think one of the great things about living in this greater community is, unlike a lot of my friends who are urban artists who tend to hang around together and talk together and kind of clique up, my friends and the people that are around me do all kinds of things. They work in the mine, they're farmers, they're carpenters, they're plumbers, they're teachers, so I just feel like I'm embedded in a real community of people with a whole range of different kinds of perspectives and different life skills, but that in small communities you have to make that work, and people do. And I like it that at least in Sussex, the town council works. They're not screaming at each other. They're not ideologically, they haven't become ideological idiots like so much of the rest of the world. So I just feel like this place is kind of right-sized. I get a little worried when everybody talks about growth, because you see so many places that were like Sussex that somehow tipped over into something else, more suburban, and people didn't know each other so much. So it was a great place to have a kid. We live in Markhamville, in a fantastic small community where we're very much in touch with people. And when we moved there at the age of 21, I guess, the neighbors were so unbelievably supportive and curious and way too respectful. Because we'd been to university, they seemed to think we knew everything about working in the woods and farming. And we didn't know much about anything. So they would always tell us after we'd done stupid things, oh, well, we wouldn't have done it that way. Oh, you should never try to peel bark in the spring, or the fall. So,
You say, college boy.
Yeah, exactly. Or they're not so smart after all. Anyway, it's just been, it's why we've stayed and put down roots, and I can't really imagine being anywhere else. We've traveled a lot, seen a lot of fantastic places, but when we get home, man, are we glad to be here. I think that might be a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, so are there any further questions, or we're going to be hovering about? So, yeah.
One short question, Peter. You were talking about materials and experience with materials. What's the material that's next on the agenda?
I think bread and cheese.
That's a good answer.
I never really quite know, to tell you the truth.
I know.
Yep. Okay, Beth says she knows. Oh, well, that's metal. I'm working with wire a lot right now and anodized aluminum. So
We're sniffing around possibly something at the Beaverbrook.
yeah. So that's the new thing. I'm working with wire and I'm making these long entangled things that I realize I'm having back problems, and I've been looking at them and thinking, no, wait a minute. These all look rather spinal.
Yeah, it's going to be a sculpture of a guy. Yeah. Wow. Well, look, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It really means a lot. And I know, certainly from the Beaverbrook's point of view and personally, to work with Peter's been really, and Beth's been one of the great professional pleasures of my life. And I know that so many, thousands and through the other tens of thousands of people have walked through, this, but larger versions of this throughout Eastern Canada, and have been really mesmerized by it and really enthused. So thank you, Peter, for 50 years and for a whole bunch more that are going to keep coming.
Thank you for your wisdom and guidance and putting it all together, and especially for doing the book, because the book will outlast.
Book will outlast all of it, absolutely, yeah. Great.
And so anybody who has questions or wants to walk around, maybe we'll get the chairs out of the way and turn the lights on, and I'll hang around for a while. So if you got questions or whatever, fire away.
Thank you.